What is clear is that what the Ukrainians had always said, which is that the minute Nord Stream 2 is finished, Russia will invade Ukraine, was true. It was extremely prescient. It is increasingly clear that it is impossible to overstate the importance that energy has played in getting us to the geopolitical and military crisis that we as the world are now in. Going back, what got us here is a policy in Germany, principally Germany, called Ostpolitik, which dates back to the Cold War. German leaders decided that the best way to influence the Soviet Union was through developing stronger and deeper ties. The logic was that countries that trade together do not ever go back to war against each other. It is certainly true that trade with the West was part of what helped bring down the Soviet Union regime. But Germany continued with that program and continued with that policy. And so Germany's reliance, and not just Germany, but I'm singling Germany out because it's the most extreme case. Germany and in turn Europe's reliance on Russian energy sources over the course of the last 20 years has reached extraordinary levels, to the point that the European Union was reliant on Russia for over 45% of its energy imports. That's every kind of energy. That's natural gas, it's oil products like diesel, it's also coal. And so it gave Russia an extraordinary amount of leverage. Because of course, when you have countries in Europe that are dependent on Russian energy sources for almost half of their domestic consumption needs, Russia then has the ability to turn off the lights and turn off the heat and leave European countries in very desperate and vulnerable and energy insecure positions. It in turn then becomes a very useful political tool, because once you have countries that are scared of their vulnerability and scared of the power you wield over them, you have the ability to influence some of their political decisions. A good example was after the 2014 annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia. Russia reacted to the revolution in Ukraine in 2014 by seizing Crimea. The United States and some other countries imposed sanctions in an effort to punish Russia for doing so, and in an effort to deter any future action, which obviously didn't work, but we will get to that later. Germany decided not to impose those sanctions, and it decided not to because Germany was by then hooked on cheap Russian natural gas and other energy products, but specifically cheap Russian natural gas. By that point, Nord Stream 1 was already fully constructed and was transiting roughly 40 to 50 billion cubic meters of gas per year. And Nord Stream 2 was then hatched as an idea in 2015 to double down on this interdependence between Russia's economy and Germany's gas needs. And Germany was the most strident in its intentionality as it embraced Russian energy sources. But certainly Austria finds itself in a great deal of trouble. Italy finds itself in a great deal of trouble. So does the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom did not even import much energy from Russia. But the knock-on effects of the energy crisis are hitting everyone everywhere. So that gets us roughly up to before 2014. So the energy interdependence becomes extreme. Nord Stream 2 is proposed. Germany and under Angela Merkel embraces this. This becomes a big international fight amongst countries. The US in particular strongly opposed Nord Stream 2. And it did that particularly because it did not think it was geostrategically advisable for Europe to be giving Russia even more energy leverage and therefore political leverage over the European bloc. Europe disagreed, or rather the European Union agreed, but Germany disagreed. And because of the intricacies of energy law in the European Union, Germany to some extent got to decide. When the US decided to lift sanctions last year on the Nord Stream 2 construction apparatus, it had the functional effect of approving Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 was then completed towards the end of 2021. At the same time, what Russia was doing was busily building up its energy leverage even further. It drained German gas storages because Germany had not just made itself dependent on Russian energy, it had also given Gazprom control over its natural gas storages. And that meant that Europe felt an energy crisis last year. That, in retrospect, was very clearly Russia getting ready to invade Ukraine. And it was ratcheting up the pressure on Europe so that when it invaded, Europe, it calculated, could not afford to object and could not afford to come to the defense of Ukraine. Europe is having a hard time because of energy shortages and because of the inflationary effect of high energy prices on everything. So energy accounts for somewhere between 25 and 50% of inflation, depending on the country. And what Europe has been through is a radical spike in energy prices that have put huge pressure on the economies of the European bloc countries, and for that matter, every other economy as well. So energy is the principal driver of that. So what we're seeing currently in Europe are blackouts in some places where utilities cannot continue to full-time supply electricity, and prices are up 10%. 10 times, not 10%. They're up 10 times, a factor of 10 in many of these cases. And so you have utilities that are not able to continue producing electricity without massive government bailouts. You also have consumers who are being hit by inflation across the board and cannot afford to spend an extra few thousand euros or pounds or whatever the currency is a month to keep their cars filled with petrol, to keep their houses warm, and to keep the lights on. Famous last words, watch it go wrong. But natural gas storages in Europe right now are over 90% full. That's more, 15% more than this time last year. So this winter, Europe has an adequate cushion with which it can ride out cold weather. But Europe is not in a terrible position. Prices are very, very high, but they do have adequate reserves, unless it's a shockingly cold winter or unless very, very unpredictable events come to pass. The real problem is next winter, because what's happened is that Putin played his trump card of turning off energy to Europe, mostly. Again, still some coming through Ukraine. There are little pieces here and there, but mostly turned off the taps to Europe. But he waited too late. So he waited until a point when turning off the taps was already past the point at which Europe had managed to get enough gas into storage to survive the winter. He misplayed his hand. However, that is very unlikely to happen again. So if Putin remains in power, he is almost certainly not going to reward Europe for defending and supporting Ukraine by giving it cheap energy back. Almost certainly not. If Putin is not in power, sure, there is a chance that some very, very pragmatic leadership takes the helm of Russia and manages to steer the hydrocarbon sector back into full operations and re-win the trust of the West, and do it within just a few months. But that's extremely unlikely as well. And there's also the possibility that what we see in Russia is something resembling a failed state, or some level of deep insecurity, instability, and chaos. Perhaps not as much as a failed state, but somewhere on that spectrum. And if that's the case, Russia is not going to be a viable energy partner for Europe anyway. I think that US foreign policy often favors optimism, and that therefore a great deal of optimism that diplomacy and the threat of sanctions would prevent and deter a Russian invasion was part of the game. Intelligence failures have been reported in mass media that suggest that everybody was wrong about how fast Kiev would fall. Now, on one hand, that's probably because everyone overestimated Russia's military capabilities and preparedness. And on the other hand, because everybody underestimated the Ukrainian fighting spirit. And all of those collectively get us to a misunderstanding that Putin was serious and a misunderstanding of how fast the war would go and how long it would last. Since then, I think everybody has adjusted, and the Western world at least has risen to the challenge of supporting Ukraine. Certainly, it would have been cheaper and there would have been much less loss of life if full support had begun in advance of the invasion or as soon after as possible. But instead, it took some time to ramp up. The world is understandably worried about starting World War III with a direct confrontation on Russia. That is a very reasonable concern. It is nonetheless true that more could have been done earlier on. The other truth about the energy crisis is that it has accelerated the energy transition. So in the very short term, everybody is scrambling for coal and oil and gas, yes. But what all of these countries have realized is that they should have triply invested in renewables and other alternatives, because that's what's going to save them from this situation in the future. So reasonable investors, understandably, do not think that it is a good investment prospect to be building massive hydrocarbon infrastructure. So next year is going to be the real crisis, and anybody who thinks this year is bad should buckle up. It's going to get a lot worse next year. What is clear is that Putin thought he could get away with it. And he thought he could get away with it because Europe in particular, but the world, needed Russian energy. He was wrong. What we have seen is a massive Western world rallying to support Ukraine. It took some time to get ramped up. There was some reticence on both sides of the Atlantic, but now there is a very clear support for Ukraine in the entire Western world. A couple of small exceptions like Hungary, but that's a separate conversation. So credit to the United States for rallying and keeping together this Western bloc of support for Ukraine. However, at the same time, it is nonetheless true that Putin was right, that Europe could not afford to cut off Russian energy. So what we've seen since the invasion is the phasing in of certain energy embargoes, while workarounds are still in play. So for example, Russia continues to sell crude on international markets, where it is then remixed and repackaged and ends up probably back in European refineries. Russia has been selling LNG from its 2 LNG terminals straight back to Europe. Meanwhile, China has been buying Russian gas and simultaneously selling its excess capacity from the United States based on pre-existing long-term natural gas contracts, LNG contracts, and it's been selling it back to Europe. And in fact, up through August of this year, Europe was importing 20+% more diesel from Russia than it had been this time last year. So it's a very mixed situation. The end result is that although there is political and military opposition to what Putin is doing to Ukraine, the Russian coffers are overflowing because the increase in gas prices and the increase in crude prices and the increase across the entire energy landscape has made so much profit for Russia that by its own calculations, it's looking at a 38% budget increase, revenue increase in 2022 over 2021, just from energy income. That's 337 billion more than it was expecting or than it received last year. It has already, since the start of the invasion, earned 200 billion over profits from last year. That's just since the invasion. And of that, over 100 billion is directly from Europe. So Russia's in good shape, and Russia is defying the sanctions damage by continuing to make money on the energy markets. And that money is then going to support its atrocities in Ukraine. So Putin calculated correctly on one hand and incorrectly on the other hand. And the end result is this something of a geopolitical stalemate, where we like to say that Russia is about to implode, or that the Russian people are about to remove Vladimir Putin as president, or that Ukraine is about to turn the military tide and win the war. We'd love all of those things to happen, except on the other hand, Russia seems to be doing just fine. And the truth is probably a balance somewhere in the middle. It might be that Russia is in grave economic hardship and danger in the long run, but in the short and to medium term, it's actually looking better and better.